Two nations, no formal declaration of war. Yet buildings collapse in Damascus, scientists disappear in Tehran, and ships burn in open water. Something is happening. Something the headlines refuse to fully explain. Billions of dollars are moving, quietly, carefully, in the dark. And the people making those moves know something the rest of the world doesn't. What if this war was never meant to be seen? What if the most dangerous battlefield on Earth has no map, no uniform, and no end date? What you are about to discover will change how you read every business headline for the rest of your life. Welcome to Battle Vault TV, the channel where wars are decoded as economic events and history is studied like a balance sheet. Now, before we go any further, a small but very important request. That subscribe button sitting right below this video. Think of it like a newspaper that your grandfather used to get delivered every single morning at his doorstep. Reliable, serious, and always worth reading. Press it. Don't let the important news pass you by. And one more thing, drop a comment right now and tell the world where you are watching from. There is a war happening right now, but it does not look like any war the world has seen before. There are no front lines drawn on a map, no tanks rolling through city streets on the evening news, no official declarations signed by two governments. And yet, the evidence of this war is everywhere, for those who know where to look. A senior military commander is killed in an airstrike in Syria. An Iranian nuclear scientist is found dead under circumstances that are never fully explained. A cargo ship sailing through the Red Sea suddenly catches fire. A weapons depot in Iraq explodes, without warning in the middle of the night. Each event reported separately. Each event treated as isolated. But they are not isolated. They are chapters in the same story, a story that has been building for decades. This is the shadow war between Iran and Israel, and it is one of the most consequential conflicts in modern economic history. To understand how this war operates, one must first understand its architecture. Like any complex structure, this conflict was not built overnight. It was designed layer by layer, over generations, with money, ideology, intelligence, and strategic patience. Iran's approach is one of calculated indirection. Rather than confronting Israel directly, a move that would invite devastating military retaliation and international isolation, Tehran built a network. Analysts and researchers who have studied this network describe it as an axis of resistance. It stretches from the mountains of Lebanon, through the fractured cities of Syria and Iraq, all the way to the coastal cities of Gaza. Each node in this network serves a purpose. Hezbollah in Lebanon functions as Iran's most powerful deterrent, a military force that has, over the years, accumulated more rockets than many standing national armies. Hamas in Gaza applies persistent pressure on Israel's southern border. The militias scattered across Iraq and Syria create what strategists call strategic depth, the ability to threaten, disrupt, and exhaust an enemy from multiple directions simultaneously. But here is what the business community must understand. This network is not free. It costs money, significant money. Estimates from think tanks and regional analysts place Iran's annual spending on its proxy network somewhere between $2 billion and $4 billion every single year. That money has to come from somewhere. And the mechanisms through which it moves, oil smuggling, currency bypasses, front companies registered in third-party jurisdictions, are the same mechanisms that distort regional trade, inflate risk premiums, and quietly reprice assets in markets that most investors believe are entirely unconnected to Middle Eastern conflict. The architecture of this war, in other words, is also the architecture of a hidden economic system, and that system is far larger and far more deeply embedded in global finance than most business leaders currently recognize. That recognition begins now. There is an old saying in the world of strategy: the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy cannot see. Iran and Israel both understood this long before the rest of the world caught up. And so, while the headlines focused on missiles and military parades, both nations were quietly building something far more powerful than any conventional weapon ever manufactured. They were building economic arsenals. Consider Iran first. When the United States and European powers placed sanctions on Iran, cutting it off from the international banking system, freezing its assets, and restricting its oil exports, most analysts predicted that the Iranian economy would collapse within years. It would run out of money. Its proxies would lose funding. Its influence would shrink. That prediction turned out to be dangerously wrong. Instead of collapsing, Iran did something that every serious entrepreneur and business strategist should study very carefully. It adapted. Iran built what economists now call a sanctions-resistant economy, a parallel financial architecture invisible to Western regulators, but fully functional on its own terms. Oil was sold through a web of intermediary buyers, shell companies registered in friendly jurisdictions, ghost tankers that turned off their GPS tracking in open water, and transactions settled not in US dollars, but in currencies and commodities that bypassed the SWIFT banking network entirely. The numbers are striking. Despite being one of the most heavily sanctioned nations on Earth, Iran continued generating billions annually from energy exports alone. A significant portion of that revenue moved directly into its regional proxy network, fueling the very conflict that sanctions were designed to stop. This is the first economic lesson of the shadow war. Sanctions create pressure, but pressure, applied to an adaptive system, does not always produce collapse. Sometimes it produces innovation. Now consider Israel's counter-strategy, and it is equally sophisticated. Where Iran leveraged indirection and shadow networks, Israel leveraged something arguably more powerful in the modern global economy, technology, intelligence, and the weaponization of Western financial systems. Israel's cybersecurity industry, largely seeded by veterans of its elite military intelligence units, has grown into one of the most valuable technology sectors on Earth. Companies emerging from units like Unit 8000 have raised billions in venture capital, listed on global stock exchanges, and quietly embedded Israeli intelligence capabilities into the digital infrastructure of governments and corporations worldwide. This is not merely a commercial success story. It is a strategic economic weapon. When a nation's private sector generates the world's most advanced surveillance, encryption, and cyber-offensive tools, and when those tools are purchased by governments across Europe, Asia, and the Gulf, that nation has effectively extended its strategic reach far beyond its geographic borders without firing a single conventional shot. Israel also understood early that its greatest geopolitical leverage lay not in military size. It is a small country by every measure, but in its irreplaceable position within Western political and financial networks, access to U.S. military funding, preferred trade arrangements, technology transfer agreements. These are not diplomatic luxuries. They are carefully maintained economic lifelines that directly fund Israel's ability to sustain a prolonged shadow conflict. Here is what this means for the business community. Both Iran and Israel have, over decades, constructed economic systems specifically designed to survive, and in some cases to profit from, the continuation of this conflict. That is not an accident. It is a policy. And when do sophisticated state actors build conflict-sustaining economies, the cost of that conflict does not stay inside their borders. It radiates outward, into oil prices, into shipping insurance rates, into cybersecurity budgets, into the risk calculations of every multinational company operating anywhere near the region. The weapons of this war are not just drones and precision missiles. They are balance sheets, supply chains, currency corridors, and the quiet movement of capital through systems most investors never think to examine. The entrepreneur who understands this does not just survive the shadow war. They see it coming before the rest of the market does. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a single door. Behind that door, roughly 21 million barrels of oil pass through every single day. One door, one narrow stretch of water, and on either side of it, two of the most hostile forces in the modern world. Now imagine that door, slowly starting to creak. That door has a name, the Strait of Hormuz, and what happens around it does not stay around it. Most people watching this video have never visited the Middle East. Many have never studied its geography, but every single one of them, whether they realize it or not, has already paid a price for the shadow war. They paid it at the fuel pump. They paid it in the rising cost of imported goods. They paid it in the quietly inflated prices sitting on supermarket shelves in cities thousands of miles from any conflict zone. This is the first and most important truth about the global spillover of the Iran-Israel shadow war. Distance is no longer a protection. Begin with oil, because everything in the modern economy begins with oil. Approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. This includes the energy exports of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself. When tension rises in the Persian Gulf, when tankers are attacked, when naval vessels are shadowed, when proxy forces fire on infrastructure, the global oil market does not wait for confirmation. It reacts immediately, instinctively, and disproportionately. A single drone strike on a Saudi oil facility in 2019 caused oil prices to spike by 15% in a single day, the largest single-day jump in nearly 3 decades. No war was declared. No major pipeline was permanently destroyed. The facility was repaired within weeks. But the market had already spoken. It had revealed something critical, that the risk premium built into global energy prices is not a theoretical concept. It is a real, Measurable cost that flows directly from the architecture of the shadow war into the wallets of ordinary consumers, small business owners, and large corporations simultaneously. For entrepreneurs building logistics businesses, manufacturing operations, or import-dependent supply chains, this risk premium is not a footnote in an economics textbook. It is a live variable sitting inside every cost calculation they make. Now move beyond oil, because the spillover does not stop there. The Red Sea Corridor, one of the most critical maritime trade routes connecting Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, has experienced significant disruption in recent years directly linked to the shadow war's expanding geography. Houthi forces in Yemen, operating within Iran's broader proxy network, began targeting commercial shipping vessels passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The response from global shipping companies was immediate and expensive. Maersk, MSC, CMA-CGM, some of the largest shipping operators on Earth, rerouted their vessels away from the Red Sea entirely, adding thousands of miles and weeks of additional transit time. Through the longer Cape of Good Hope route around southern Africa, the financial consequence was not abstract. Container shipping rates surged by over 100% within weeks of the disruption's beginning. Every company importing goods through that corridor faced an immediate, unplanned cost increase, that were ultimately passed down through supply chains and absorbed, quietly, by consumers worldwide. This is the shadow war's most underappreciated economic mechanism. It does not require a full-scale military conflict to generate full-scale economic consequences. It only requires the credible threat of disruption, maintained consistently, over time, to permanently inflate the cost of doing business across entire industries. European energy markets felt it in elevated natural gas prices. Asian manufacturers felt it in delayed component shipments. Gulf sovereign wealth funds felt it in the repricing of regional risk. Insurance underwriters in London felt it in escalating marine war risk premiums on every vessel transiting within 500 miles of the Persian Gulf. And here is the number that should stop every serious business leader cold. Economist and risk analyst estimate that the cumulative economic cost of Middle Eastern instability, factoring in energy price distortions, shipping disruptions, elevated defense spending, and suppressed regional investment, runs into hundreds of billions of dollars annually across the global economy. Not millions, hundreds of billions, paid not by governments alone, but distributed invisibly across businesses, pension funds, trade budgets, and consumer prices on every continent. The shadow war between Iran and Israel does not stay in the Middle East. It travels through pipelines, through shipping lanes, through satellite uplinks carrying cyber attacks, through the risk models of insurance actuaries sitting in quiet offices in Zurich and Singapore. It arrives, silently, without announcement, on the balance sheets of companies that have never once considered themselves exposed to Middle Eastern geopolitics. That assumption of distance, of separation, of immunity, is the most expensive mistake a business leader can make today. Most people watch a war unfold on a screen and think to themselves, that is terrible. I hope it ends soon. Then they close the app and go back to their business. But the most successful entrepreneurs and investors in modern history have always understood something fundamentally different about conflict. They understood that every war, visible or invisible, is also a market event. And market events do not wait for permission to affect your business. Here is the single most important question a business leader must ask themselves right now. Not will this conflict escalate, not which side will win, but rather, how is this conflict already repricing the world I operate in, and am I positioned correctly for what comes next? That question, asked early enough, answered honestly enough, is the difference between a business that survives a geopolitical disruption and one that is quietly destroyed by it. Begin with the sectors that historically expand during prolonged shadow conflicts, because they are already moving. Defense technology is the most visible. Global defense spending crossed $2 trillion for the first time in recorded history in recent years. But the sophisticated investor does not simply buy defense stocks and wait. They look deeper at the second and third order beneficiaries, the semiconductor companies supplying chips, to weapon systems, the satellite communication firms providing battlefield intelligence, infrastructure, the private logistics operators managing defense supply chains across 3 continents. These are not glamorous investments. They are structural ones, built on the most reliable customer in any economic environment. A government preparing for prolonged conflict does not reduce its defense budget when markets fall. It increases it. Cybersecurity represents perhaps the single greatest growth sector emerging directly from the shadow war's DNA. Consider what has already happened. Iran has conducted significant cyber attacks against Israeli financial institutions, water infrastructure, and government systems. Israel, and its private sector extensions, has responded with some of the most sophisticated offensive and defensive cyber operations ever documented. Both nations have effectively turned the digital economy into a second battlefield, and that battlefield has no geographic boundary. Every company, regardless of industry, regardless of location, that operates on a connected digital infrastructure is now a potential target in a conflict it never chose to enter. The global cybersecurity market is projected to exceed $300 billion annually within this decade. That growth is not driven by corporate caution alone. It is driven by the lived experience of watching state-sponsored cyber attacks dismantle critical infrastructure in real time. For the young entrepreneur building a technology business today, cybersecurity is not an optional expense item on a budget spreadsheet. It is the price of existing in the modern economy. Alternative energy is the third sector that serious capital is quietly repositioning toward, and the strategic logic is straightforward. Every business leader who has watched oil prices spike 15% in a single day because of a drone strike in Saudi Arabia understands viscerally what energy dependency costs. The long-term institutional move away from fossil fuel dependency is not purely environmental conviction. Significant portions of it are driven by cold, rational energy security calculations made in boardrooms that have grown tired of having their cost structures held hostage to Middle Eastern geopolitical events, solar infrastructure, battery storage technology, regional energy independence projects. These are not idealistic ventures. They are strategic hedges against the perpetual instability of a region that sits beneath 48% of the world's proven oil reserves. Now, perhaps most importantly, consider how sophisticated capital is already moving. Gulf sovereign wealth funds, sitting at the intersection of this conflict geographically, have been systematically diversifying away from regional concentration. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth vehicles have been aggressively deploying capital into Asian technology, European infrastructure, and American private equity. The message embedded in those moves is not subtle. Even the wealthiest actors closest to this conflict are quietly reducing their exposure to it. Institutional investors managing pension funds across Europe and Asia have been similarly recalibrating their emerging market allocations, increasing risk premiums on Middle Eastern assets and quietly redirecting capital flows toward markets with lower geopolitical variance. This is not panic. This is precision. And it carries a direct message for every entrepreneur and business leader watching this video today. The shadow war between Iran and Israel is not a future risk sitting on a distant horizon. It is a present reality already embedded in the cost of energy, the price of shipping, the architecture of digital security, and the movement of institutional capital across the global economy. The businessmen who will build the most resilient enterprises over the next decade will not be those who ignore this conflict, hoping geography would protect them. They will be those who studied it clearly, positioned themselves deliberately, and understood that in a world of shadow wars, the most dangerous position of all is the assumption that none of this concerns you. This has been Battle Vault TV, where history is decoded as strategy, and strategy is built for those serious enough to act on it. If this analysis added value to your thinking, share it with one person in your network who needs to hear it. The next briefing is already being prepared.